Now on 4, Libby Cross and Mark Todd with Same Difference.
This week, are disabled people clutching at straws by trying to be normal? And does society put too much importance on what we look like instead of who we are?
But first, if you're a regular viewer of Same Difference, you'll know that over the last 2 years, we've been following the progress of the Americans with Disabilities Act through the US Congress. But just last week, we heard that the Act had run into some problems. Mark has the details.
What do you want? Access! What do you want? Access!
America, unlike Britain, has a long history of protest and civil rights campaigns. In the 60s, black people used direct action to demand legislation that would safeguard their hard-fought-for emancipation. Learning from this, disabled people in America have mounted a very high-profile campaign to support the Americans with Disabilities Act, the first comprehensive civil rights charter for disabled people ever to be put before a national government. This march, which took place last Monday, brought thousands of disabled people onto the streets of Washington. But why the need to protest now? I spoke to Richard Wood, just back from the States.
In 1988, the Senate passed the original document, but then it has to go through a consultative process. And now there's such a big lobby in America from people like that, the housing syndicates, the transport, American Transport, Passenger Transport Association, to try to get amendments into the bill. And disabled people there are worried that if those amendments go through, then in fact the civil rights that they should have gained won't be gained.
Why are they trying to get all these amendments in?
Of course, to make like every piece of public transport accessible is going to cost a phenomenal amount of money. And people like Greyhound, who are a major operator out there, and they've become one of the major lobbyists to get the amendments in.
Could you tell us exactly what sort of form the action took?
Disabled people wanted to make the point that they didn't even have access to Capitol buildings, and so they got out of the wheelchairs and crawled up the steps. So they were saying this was the level that they were being reduced to, that they were having to crawl to the government for their rights.
But this was only for starters. The next day, 250 people went back and occupied a government building.
They chained all their wheelchairs together so that they couldn't be removed. Well, apparently it's a federal offence to demonstrate in the Capitol, in any Capitol building. So then, of course, I mean, the SWAT, as they're called, which are the Washington riot police, turned up in full armour, helmets, shields and the lot. They were totally bemused. 104 people were arrested that afternoon. When people were going to court on the Thursday, I mean, it was quite funny in a way, because people would say, that, you know, the judge would say, well, how many times have you been arrested before? And they were saying, oh, I don't know, so many times I can't remember. And it's just now a natural thing with them. Well, we've not got to that stage, and we've not really discussed whether we ought to get to that stage. They clearly have. It's a big thing to get involved in. As somebody said to me, it's when you're out there in the numbers, like 100 and odd getting arrested, it's quite exhilarating. When you're there one-to-one with the police after, it's very intimidating. And then you've got to go through the court process. It can't just rest, you see, on the issue of, well, let's go out and get arrested. And nor does it in America. This is part of a constant process of lobbying all these senators that they know are going to vote against it. They follow them round to all public meetings, and they hassle them at every public speech that these people give. They're there saying, you know, what about disability rights?
Well, let's hope all that lobbying will force the American government to get its priorities right. And if you'd like to add your voice to the protest, why not call and let us know?
The number's 0800 717170, and the lines are open for the next 3 hours. Later on, we take an in-depth look at why some people just want to be normal. But first, Libby catches up on some of your calls from last week in Your Say.
Jill Farrell rang about our report on the performance of Freaks in Glasgow last week. She saw the play and had no misgivings about it.
It was very effective, it was very moving, and it was a wonderful play.
And she had this to say to the disabled people in the audience who found the play offensive.
To say that it was some form of circus or Beauty and the Beast, someone referred to it as, it was absolute nonsense. I think they missed the whole point of the play.
But Virginia Rich from Cornwall took exception to the attitude of the theatre company's artistic director, Genevieve de Kermabon.
But she didn't seem to care. She hadn't even taken that into consideration, that it might offend some people. You can't just say, oh, we'll do it, but we don't give a toss about what the public think.
Our look at the news media produced an array of views on the subject. Carol Graham was particularly disappointed by the performance of the two editors in the follow-up interview.
Well, I thought they were pathetic. I really did. I didn't think they said anything new. I was expecting them to sort of protect themselves, and they didn't.
It might have been that they couldn't. Carol felt especially let down by the editor of The Guardian.
He was almost as bad as the man from the News of the World, and I was really shocked by it. It really depressed me.
Roy Graham, no relation to Carol, was incensed by the same interview, but for totally different reasons. He objected to Mark's approach.
It was as though he declared war on them, no matter what they were going to say or what they were going to offer.
Is that all? Apparently not.
He was too bombastic. Just wasn't going to budge.
Mr. Graham thinks that Mark did more harm than good.
I think he was speaking for him and not the disabled as a whole.
Although he isn't disabled himself, Roy knows a bit about our views on the subject.
The majority of people do not object to being called a cripple.
Judge that one for yourselves. Jenny Purcell didn't mind us having a go at the News of the World. She pointed out that the editor regularly goes on the attack.
So if he's prepared to dish things out to people, he should be prepared to take it. I don't think you were hard on him at all.
Should we not have been a little bit nicer to those defenceless editors of the national press?
No, I think we have to stand up for ourselves. No, it's about time that we did.
Most people must have seen press stories by now of parents who'll do almost anything if it'll help teach their disabled children to walk. But why is it so important to get up on your own 2 feet? Libby reports.
Just 2 weeks ago, millions of BBC viewers saw young Emmett, whose legs are affected by cerebral palsy, undergo an enormous operation.
Somewhere inside the Gate computer was a specification for the perfect human body, and Dr. Gage is going to use it as his model. Emmett's legs will be broken in 4 places. 3 of his leg muscles will be moved to new positions. 7 more muscles will be lengthened. In all, 14 separate surgical procedures will be attempted in this one operation by 2 teams of surgeons working in tandem on either side of Emmett's body. They're going to take his legs and thighs to bits and rebuild them as close to perfection as possible.
And why was Emmett going through all this?
It'll probably be a year before the full benefit of the surgery can be seen. And if everything goes to plan, he won't ever need a wheelchair.
And of course, Emmett's not the only young person to make tremendous efforts to walk. In the last couple of years, it seems that the press and many parents of children with cerebral palsy and spina bifida have been obsessed with getting them to Hungary. Their hope is that the Peto Institute can help them to function more like able-bodied people.
2 hands. Up onto the next one.
We believe the main hope for our son to become independent lies in conductive education. I feel it's benefiting Matthew because we can see the progress Matthew's making. I feel we've got to continue with it for his sake because I continue to remind myself of what the alternative is. And I feel the alternative is that he will end up in a wheelchair in this country. And if he went into one, I fear he wouldn't come out of it.
Of course, adults also go to the Peto Institute in search of better walking ability. The press also seized on the sad story of P.C. Olds, who pioneered the walking brace. Some people with spinal injuries are now using a brace. For some, it's a way of being on the same level as the able-bodied world. For others, it's to help keep them fit until medical science finds a way of mending the damaged spinal cord. So why do some people feel such an overwhelming need to walk? Mike Oliver is a lecturer in education studies at Thames Polytechnic. He believes disabled people are under tremendous pressure to become as normal as possible.
It affects everybody. It affects handicapped children before they're born. They can be aborted if they're not normal. It affects kids who are not normal and therefore get doses of conductive education. It affects those of us who can't walk and are assumed therefore not to be normal and have to have Petrovsky's wires implanted in us and stagger around and so on. It affects old people who are not normal because they can't make their own dinners anymore or wipe their own bottoms. There's this ideology which underpins all medical and rehabilitative techniques.
Recently, Mike's views about society's non-acceptance of disability have focused on conductive education.
It's based upon this ideology of normality. And, you know, there are hundreds, thousands of disabled people throughout the world now who've shown that high expectations and motivation you can achieve what you want to achieve as a disabled person, not as a kind of poor or pathetic reproduction of an able-bodied person.
But for Virginia Beardshaw, who's taken her child to Hungary, conductive education means something very different.
It is a holistic learning system for children who find learning difficult because they're brain damaged. And what it teaches them to do is to cope with the physical environment better by moving around in it and by solving problems for themselves. There are no children that walk out of the Peto Institute normal. They move out more mobile. It's very important to be able to get around physically.
So could the parents of disabled children being taken to Budapest be accused of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole?
People feel they must do everything in their power to give their child the best possible deal.
So is the desire to walk a healthy and motivating activity? Or is it just conforming to the social pressure that keeps disabled people out in the cold? To find out, Mark's joined by Virginia Beardshaw and Mike Oliver, and a group of people with views and experiences from all sides of the debate.
Paul Kelly, if I can come to you first, your son's actually been to the Peto Institute. It's a long way to go. Was it worth it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. He was there for 6 months. The actual Peto Institute was there for 6 months. I think the first thing that hit, she was confident, very, very confident child after doing conductive education. I think things like balance. It's not just about walking, you see, conductive education. His balance was better. He could put weight through his legs. He could pick things up. He could feed himself easily. All these things make a complete child, and that's what conductive education is all about.
Mike, I mean, you've got views on conductive education. There's a child here who's obviously benefited from it. What have you got against it?
I have nothing against some of the things that conductive education does, but a lot of what Paul said is an appalling indictment of the special education system that we have in this country and the low expectation that professionals have in this country, because the problem with conductive education is it's underpinning it is this idea that you have to adapt individuals to the world as it is.
disabled people for the last 10 years have been arguing and have shown very clearly that the only solution is the other way round. The world has to adapt to us. We don't want to be changed. We don't want to be turned into anything else. We want to be accepted. In fact, we demand to be accepted as we are, and the world must change to accommodate us.
What Paul said underlines some of the problems with the peto-conductive education approach. Because what he's basically said, started off by saying the medical treatment that you get here is not adequate, so you go to Hungary. At the same time, the Hungarian approach presents itself as an educational approach. And I think that this is fundamentally wrong, because what they've taken is educational skills, educational techniques, and corrupted them to achieve medical goals. The medical goals are to make kids normal. Now, it seems to me that we've got inadequate medical approaches here, and what we should be seeing is improvements in those approaches. But then to think that the solution is to have an educational approach in another country seems to me totally wrong, and it doesn't have a holistic approach to the child. On the contrary, it turns a child into a medical problem.
So, Virginia, are we talking about a medical problem or education? I mean,
I think this really underlines for me a lot of misunderstanding around what brain damage does to kids who are born with it. Brain damage puts children in a position of passivity. I don't think that conductive education is a corrupted educational system. I think what it does is really focus on the child and the child's abilities, not his disabilities, but his abilities.
I visited the Institute and I was treated like a child. And I was treated like a child because that is the way they operate. No disabled adults have participated in developing conductive education. And when I asked them what contribution had disabled adults made to this, they looked at me as though I was mad. That was a question you don't ask people.
Angela, you've been to the Peto Institute. Do you agree with what Vic's saying?
No. I mean, I found the opposite for the first time in my life. People had treated my disability with respect, and I said my query about what it's doing to me and why I don't function the way I want to, and I found the whole experience liberating.
Bob, I know you're in, you've got a few reservations about conductive education, but, I mean, what do you like about it? I know you've got some things you like about it.
If I could take in isolation the issue of self-confidence, the issue of how to use my own body, etc., that would be fine. But that would be about me, people like me, having control over how we want to use the methods of learning.
Bill, we saw you using your parawalker. Are you trying to be normal? I mean, you want to stand upright. What's the big deal about being in a wheelchair?
I think the difference here is that I was involved in a motorcycle accident when I was 21. Up until then, I was, in inverted commas, normal. After that point, I changed. I became wheelchair dependent. Whilst I walk in a parawalk, it wasn't forced on me. I chose that route. I wish to get back to standing up, as the human body is designed to do. There's nothing wrong with that.
So, Mike, are you trying to, I mean, the sort of views you're putting, I mean, it could be argued that you're trying to stop people having the choice to do these sort of things.
People are free to choose and should be free to choose. I think it's sad when people choose to stand or to walk or to go to Hungary to the extent that it disrupts their lives in all kinds of unacceptable ways.
It seems to me that walking and talking are wonderful things to be able to do. And I can understand that anybody would fight to be able to do those things rather than to relinquish them. I think there's an issue for people like myself and you who have maybe arrived at a point where you are able to walk, but only with extreme difficulty. I mean, this was my experience. And then it was a question of how well I could walk and whether it was worth staggering around, incapacitating my arms by using crutches, or whether, in fact, I was more independent sitting in a wheelchair. And I found I was more independent sitting in a wheelchair. So eventually, I gave up the struggle to retain the ability to walk.
I mean, it seems to me that is the key issue. You see, when you target on walking, you're targeting on a very specific physical activity. You're not looking at why people walk, which is to do with mobility, to get around, to visit places. If able-bodied people only walk to work, they would never get there. So they use their own aids, their motor cars, their trains, and so on. The problem with the whole normalization and this emphasis on walking is that it reinforces negative attitudes about being in a wheelchair, about being disabled. And I think in the long-term result is very counterproductive to the children that the parents want to help.
So, Virginia, are you trying to change your child when maybe you should be changing society, according to some of the people here?
I think you've got to do both. You've got to change society, but at the same time you've got to work hard to give kids the equipment that they need to be full citizens. That's really what it's about.
I, for one, do not want my son to live with the idea of counterposing his ability to disability. Disability is created by ideas such as normalization, such as the structures of society. And if you want conductive education to have meaning, you've got to break it free of all that oppression.
Part of the problem is that you can never break it free because its very success depends upon feeding these negative stereotypes, that what we actually all want as disabled people is to be turned into able-bodied people. Conductive education is a miracle. It can do it.
It sounds like you're after a miracle cure.
No, I'm not after a miracle cure, although I think that it's wrong to criticize parents who go that route with that in mind to start. I think it's a very human reaction. Nobody goes out of the peto hoping for a miracle cure, and I object just as much as Vic does to some of the publicity around the peto, which I think has been very cheap and simplistic.
Bill, I know a lot of people who use the Parawalker that you use, some of them do wait for the miracle cure. It's meant to be keeping their bodies in shape till it comes. Are you?
Right. So I'm keeping my body in trim, waiting for that medical cure. And what, you know, if I don't do that, then this cure comes along, I try and stand up, my bones can't stand my own weight.
The sad thing is that medical science has never actually cured anything. It can't even cure the common cold. So to sit around waiting for it to cure something as complex as a spinal injury seems to be a very sad situation.
Well, some of the stuff I've read from you, mate, I mean, it's been pretty strong. You've likened some of these theories to theories that come out of Nazi Germany.
Well, I think the ideology underpinning conductive education is a similar ideology to the one underpinning Nazism in Germany. And it's no accident, if you look at the history of disability, what Hitler actually did to disabled people, physically and mentally handicapped.
You a Nazi, Paul?
I don't think so. I think we've got two things here. I've got great respect for anybody in a wheelchair. Don't ask me to condemn my child to a wheelchair at 4 years old.
Conductive education is a more effective way of helping kids do the best they can with what they've got. And that's where I'll put my money. I don't want to waste money the way we do in this country and all these hopeless medical and rehabilitation methods, which in fact both Mike and Vic have spent their lifetimes criticising.
Well, I mean, I agree with Virginia that much of what happens in this country doesn't work. The answer is for us all to get together and to cooperate and to fight to turn our system into a better one, not to seek non-existent miracle cures elsewhere.
Well, there are obviously no simple answers in that debate. And if you'd like the fact sheet with more details, why not call our free phone number? It's 0800 717170.
Or you can write. Our address is Same Difference, P.O. Box 444, Bath, BA1 2TN.
Next week, we take to the road for a spot check on motorway service areas. But do they pass the test for disabled drivers?
Do join us for that. But until then, from everyone on Same Difference, goodbye.
By 1930, Joseph Stalin ruthlessly controlled the Soviet Union. But his policy of farm collectivization had led to famine. Millions were dying, and yet he exported grain to finance industrialization. Political opponents were murdered, torture was legalized, labor camps mushroomed, and the secret police executed countless victims. The Famine and the Terror. Stalin. Tomorrow at 10:45 on ITV.
There are some very nervous people in Happy Days tonight.